You don't know who to trust. You don't know who knows what. Why didn't anybody come forward? Why didn't anybody say anything?
The funeral home workers had seen thousands of bodies, natural deaths, peaceful passings, the expected end to long lives. But as their hands moved methodically over Ray Neal's body that summer afternoon in Norcross, Georgia, they froze. Beneath the assumption of a quiet death lay evidence of savage betrayal, multiple stab wounds, deliberately inflicted, carefully hidden. The kind man who had opened his door to everyone had been murdered in his own home, and for 3 long years his killer had walked free. The police missed it. The investigators missed it. Even the medical examiner missed it. They all saw what they expected to see. An elderly man with health problems who had simply passed away in his sleep. That's exactly what the killer had counted on. That's exactly why they chose him. But they didn't count on his niece Ashley, who turned her grief into a relentless pursuit of truth. They didn't expect a family's love to be stronger than their perfect murder. And they never imagined that their carefully constructed facade would crumble because of one small detail, a single fingerprint that would finally expose a predator hiding in plain sight.
Would anybody ever be charged, or would it just be a cold case that just goes on for years and years to come?
But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask for a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss out on any new videos. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case.
There's something about small towns that makes neighbors feel like family. In Norcross, Georgia, Ray Neal wasn't just another resident. He was the kind of person who made the community feel like home. His weathered hands had helped countless neighbors with their gardens. His gentle smile had greeted morning joggers for decades, and his front porch had been a sanctuary for anyone needing a moment of peace or a friendly ear. To his niece Ashley Haynes, Ray was the steady heartbeat of their family. He wasn't just an uncle who showed up at holidays or sent birthday cards. He was there for first days of school, for scraped knees, for teenage heartbreaks, and for adult victories. In a world where father figures sometimes fade away, Ray Neal stood firm. His home on that quiet Norcross street wasn't just a house. It was where Sunday dinners turned into storytelling sessions, where family traditions were born, where memories were woven into the very fabric of their lives. Even as age began leaving its mark and health issues tried to slow him down, Ray's spirit remained undiminished. His battle with hypertension might have affected his body, but it never touched his heart. If anything, his physical challenges only made him more determined to be there for his family. He'd joke that his medical conditions were just life's way of making sure he took enough breaks to appreciate the good things. The neighbors noticed how he'd still be out there, maybe moving a little slower, but never missing a chance to wave, to ask about their kids, to share a piece of wisdom or a warm laugh. That was Ray Neal, a man whose presence made others feel seen, heard, and valued. He was proof that true strength isn't measured in physical power, but in the capacity to make others feel loved. Little did anyone know that Ray's gentle nature, the very quality that made him so beloved, would make him vulnerable to someone who saw kindness as weakness and trust as an opportunity for betrayal.
In both cases, the same weapon was used. It was a large kitchen knife.
The morning of July 25th, 2019, started like any other summer day in Norcross. The Georgia sun was already pressing down on the pavement when Ashley Haynes pulled into her uncle's driveway. 3 days of unanswered calls had turned worry into a gnawing fear she couldn't shake. Ray Neal never let a call from his niece go unreturned, not in all the years she could remember. The house stood silent, too silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, wrong, like the air itself is holding its breath. Ashley would later say that even before she opened the door, something inside her already knew. But knowing and seeing are two different kinds of pain. The scene that greeted her seemed peaceful enough at first glance. Ray appeared to be sleeping in his bed, as if he had simply drifted off and never woken up. For a moment, there was almost relief. His known health issues, the hypertension, he'd battled, it all pointed to a natural end. When the police arrived, they saw what everyone else saw. An elderly man with documented medical conditions who had passed away in his sleep. But Ashley couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way the room felt, or perhaps it was just that sixth sense that comes from knowing someone your whole life. The responding officers assured her that everything pointed to natural causes. The medical history made sense. The scene was undisturbed. Her uncle had simply reached the end of his journey. As family members began arriving, their grief was tinged with a bittersweet acceptance. They shared memories, made phone calls, began the painful process of planning a funeral. They told themselves that at least he hadn't suffered, that he had gone peacefully in his sleep. They held on to that comfort as they went through his belongings, as they picked out his burial clothes, as they wrote his obituary. But sometimes peace is just a mask that violence wears, and the truth that Ashley sensed, the wrongness she couldn't name, was waiting to be discovered on a cold steel table at the funeral home, where death's final secrets can't stay hidden for long. In the clinical light of the funeral home, as staff members began their careful work, the mask of natural causes began to slip. What they found beneath turned grief into horror, peace into violence, and acceptance into burning questions that demanded answers. The discovery was brutal in its simplicity. Stab wounds, multiple and methodical, telling a story so different from what everyone had believed. These weren't minor marks that could have been overlooked in casual observation. These were deliberate wounds, each one a testament to an act of violence that had been hidden behind the convenient narrative of natural causes. When the funeral home staff made that call to the police, everything changed. The peaceful passing they'd all accepted shattered like glass, leaving behind sharp edges of truth that cut deep into the family's hearts. Ray Neal hadn't drifted away quietly in his sleep. He had been murdered in his own home, in the very place where he had made countless people feel safe and welcome. For Ashley, the revelation was both vindication and devastation. That nagging feeling she'd had, the sense that something wasn't right, it hadn't been paranoia or grief playing tricks on her mind. It had been her connection to her uncle, reaching beyond death to point toward the truth. But with that vindication came a tidal wave of questions and a new kind of pain. How had this been missed? Why hadn't anyone looked closer? What else had been overlooked? The case was immediately reclassified as a homicide. But those precious first days after death, crucial hours when evidence is freshest and leads are warmest, had been lost to the assumption of natural causes. The house hadn't been treated as a crime scene. People had moved freely through the space, inadvertently disturbing whatever clues the killer might have left behind. Time, that relentless enemy of justice, had been given a head start. As the family absorbed this horrifying new reality, their grief transformed into something else, a determined anger, a need for answers, a demand for justice. The peaceful farewell they had planned became a call to action. Ray Neal's death was no longer just a tragedy to be mourned. It was a crime that needed to be solved, a wrong that needed to be righted, a truth that needed to be brought into the light. Someone had walked away from that house thinking they had committed the perfect crime, believing that Ray's medical history would hide their brutal act. They hadn't counted on the careful eyes of funeral home workers, or the relentless love of a family that would soon begin their own quest for justice. The truth had emerged from death's shadow, and now there was no turning back. The ripples of the funeral home's discovery turned what should have been a time of mourning into a scramble for answers. Detectives who had dismissed the scene days earlier now returned with different eyes, but time had already taken its toll. What they found was a crime scene diluted by days of innocent intrusion. Family members coming and going, personal items moved, surfaces touched. The killer's traces, if they had left any, were now mixed with the ordinary signs of grief and remembrance. The initial sweep of Ray's home revealed something both telling and troubling. No signs of forced entry. The windows were intact, the locks undisturbed. This wasn't a random break-in gone wrong. Whoever had done this had likely been someone Ray knew, someone he had trusted enough to open his door to. The thought sent chills through the family. The killer might not just be a faceless stranger, but someone who had sat at Ray's table, someone who had known his routines, someone who might even now be watching their investigation unfold. Neighbors, when questioned again, began to remember things differently.
People kind of put it together in the neighborhood and started giving us calls and, giving their ideas of what they thought happened.
One recalled seeing an unfamiliar car parked on the street in the days leading up to Ray's death. Another mentioned hearing what they thought was an argument late at night, but had dismissed it as unimportant at the time. These fragments of memory, while valuable, were frustratingly vague, like trying to piece together a puzzle where the edges had been worn smooth by time. The detectives faced an uphill battle. Physical evidence that might have been crucial, fingerprints, DNA, signs of struggle, had been compromised by the initial misclassification of Ray's death. Security cameras in the area were few, and those that existed had already overwritten their footage from the critical time frame. Each passing day seemed to make the trail colder, the answers more elusive. What emerged instead was a portrait of Ray's final days, pieced together from receipts, phone records, and witness statements. He had gone about his routine as usual, visiting the local grocery store, chatting with neighbors, tending to his garden. There were no signs of distress, no indication that he felt threatened. Ray Neal had lived his last days exactly as he had lived all the others, with kindness, with routine, with trust in his fellow man. That trust, it seemed, had been his undoing. As leads dried up and witnesses' memories faded, the case began to slip from the headlines. But while the official investigation might have been stalling, another one was just beginning. Driven not by badges and protocols, but by a niece's love and a family's refusal to let Ray's murder go unanswered.
And it's just been hard trying to figure out what happened and who did it.
Ashley Haynes realized that justice for her uncle wouldn't come from waiting. She transformed her grief into purpose, her dining room table becoming a makeshift command center, papers, notes, and timeline sketches spread across its surface, a testament to her refusal to let Ray's case grow cold. She wasn't a trained detective, but she had something perhaps more valuable, an intimate knowledge of her uncle's world and a determination that wouldn't quit. Every day after work, Ashley would drive through Ray's neighborhood, talking to anyone who would listen. She learned the rhythms of the community, who was always on their porch, who walked their dogs at specific times, who might have seen something without realizing its importance. She kept detailed notes of every conversation, every small detail that might later prove significant. Her car became a familiar sight on those streets, a rolling reminder that someone was still asking questions. It was during these conversations that a name began to surface, whispered at first, then spoken with increasing frequency. Carmen Marie Hunt. The mentions came in fragments. A neighbor who had seen her lurking near Ray's house. Another who remembered her asking strange questions about who lived alone in the area. Hunt wasn't a stranger to the neighborhood, but she wasn't quite part of it either. She existed in the margins, appearing and disappearing like a shadow at the edge of vision. When Ashley brought Hunt's name to investigators, their response was frustratingly non-committal. Yes, they would look into it. Yes, they would add it to their notes. But without concrete evidence, Hunt was just another name in a file growing thick with dead ends. The system's gears turned slowly, too slowly for a niece watching her uncle's case fade from public memory. Refusing to be silenced, Ashley turned to the media. She learned to tell Ray's story in a way that made people care, that made them see past the statistics and headlines to the human being who had been lost. She spoke at community meetings, wrote letters to editors, created social media posts that kept her uncle's case alive in the public consciousness. Each interview was emotionally draining, forcing her to relive the worst day of her life. But she pushed through the pain. Ray had never given up on her. She wouldn't give up on him. Through it all, Ashley drew strength from memories of her uncle. She could almost hear his voice encouraging her, feel his steady presence guiding her forward. The same man who had taught her to ride a bike, who had celebrated her graduations, who had walked her down the aisle at her wedding, was now teaching her one final lesson about persistence, about love, about fighting for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. The investigation might have slowed to a crawl in official channels, but in the hearts and minds of those who loved Ray Neal, it never stopped. 3 years is a long time to carry the weight of an unsolved murder. 3 years of holidays without Ray, of birthdays marked by his absence, of questions that seemed destined to go unanswered. But in 2022, a seemingly unrelated arrest would crack open the case that had haunted the Neal family for so long. Carmen Marie Hunt's arrest for a violent assault in another part of town didn't make major headlines. It was just another booking, another set of fingerprints entered into the system. But those fingerprints would prove to be the key that unlocked everything. When they were run through the database, they matched evidence found at Ray's house. Evidence that had been waiting silently for 3 years. Like a letter, finally finding its intended recipient. The match wasn't just a coincidence. It was a revelation. That single bloody fingerprint placed Hunt definitively in Ray's home on the night of his death. The phantom that Ashley had been chasing, the name that had been whispered in neighborhood conversations, suddenly had substance. The pieces began falling into place with devastating clarity.
They said that they thought Carmen Hunt may have done this. She had done the same thing to someone else and was currently in our jail. And in both cases, the same weapon was used. It was a large kitchen knife. One of the things that I saw in pictures was a bloody fingerprint. Ultimately, they did match that to Carmen Hunt.
As investigators dug deeper into Hunt's history, a chilling pattern emerged. She had a record of targeting vulnerable individuals, particularly older residents who lived alone. Her method was to gain trust, to exploit kindness, to turn generosity into opportunity. Ray Neal, with his open heart and trusting nature, would have been the perfect target for someone like her. The witnesses, who had been hesitant to speak before, now found their voices. One neighbor remembered seeing Hunt watching Ray's house in the days leading up to his death, noting how she seemed to track his comings and goings. Another recalled an interaction between Hunt and Ray, him offering help, her playing the role of someone in need. What had seemed like unremarkable moments at the time now took on sinister significance. For investigators, the fingerprint was just the beginning. Armed with this new evidence, they began reconstructing the events of that July night. The lack of forced entry made sense now. Ray would have opened his door to Hunt, perhaps offering help, as he had done so many times before. The multiple stab wounds spoke of a calculated attack, not a crime of passion. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a sudden burst of violence. This was premeditated, planned, precise. The breakthrough hit the Neal family like a thunderbolt. For Ashley, who had carried her uncle's case like a torch through 3 years of darkness, the news brought a storm of emotions. Relief warred with renewed grief. Validation clashed with anger at time lost. But above all, there was a fierce satisfaction in knowing that her instincts had been right, that her persistence had played a role in keeping the case alive until science and circumstance could bring the truth to light.
I don't know if we're ever going to be relieved because we lost someone senselessly, but I think it's a sense of peace, yes.
Hunt's past started unraveling like a loose thread pulled from a sweater. Other victims came forward, speaking of encounters that had left them uneasy. A pattern of predatory behavior emerged, suggesting that Ray's murder might not have been an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern that had finally been exposed. In a courthouse, far removed from the peaceful streets of Ray Neal's neighborhood, Carmen Marie Hunt stood before justice with the same coldness that had marked her crimes. Her face betrayed no emotion as the charges were read. Felony murder and aggravated assault. The legal terms attempting to capture the magnitude of what she had stolen from the Neal family. The evidence against her was now overwhelming. That single fingerprint had opened a floodgate, leading to more discoveries that painted a picture of calculated malice. The prosecution's case was built not just on forensic evidence, but on the pattern of Hunt's behavior, the testimonies of neighbors, and the methodical reconstruction of Ray's final hours. In the stark light of the courtroom, there was nowhere left for lies to hide. For the Neal family, watching Hunt face charges was a moment loaded with complexity. Relief mingled with renewed grief as every detail of Ray's murder was laid bare in clinical legal terms. Ashley sat in the courtroom each day, her presence a silent testament to the promise she had made to never give up. But there was one person notably absent, Ray's sister, Michelle, who had passed away before seeing justice served. Her absence was yet another wound that Hunt had inflicted, another moment of closure stolen from the family. Hunt's demeanor throughout the proceedings was perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. She showed no remorse, no recognition of the lives she had shattered. When offered the chance to speak, to explain, to show any humanity, she remained silent. It was as if Ray Neal had been nothing more than an opportunity to her, not a human being with a family who loved him, with a life full of meaning and connection. The verdict, when it came, felt less like a triumph and more like the closing of a terrible chapter. Hunt's conviction brought consequences she couldn't charm or manipulate her way out of. The sentence handed down ensured she would spend decades behind bars, but for the Neal family, no number of years could truly balance the scales. Ray was still gone, his gentle presence still missed at every family gathering, every holiday, every quiet Sunday afternoon. Yet in the midst of this bittersweet justice, there was also healing. The community that had supported the Neal family throughout their ordeal that came together again, not just to mark the end of the legal proceedings, but to remember Ray as he had lived, not as a victim, but as the kind, generous soul who had touched so many lives. For Ashley, the conviction meant keeping her promise to both her uncle and her mother. She had carried their story through 3 years of uncertainty, had refused to let Ray's case go cold, had transformed her grief into the kind of determination that moves mountains. In the end, justice came, not just through the legal system, but through the unwavering love of a niece who refused to let her uncle's memory fade. Hunt's imprisonment wouldn't bring Ray back, wouldn't erase the pain of loss or fill the empty chair at family dinners, but it meant that the truth had finally come to light, that Ray's story hadn't ended in that moment of betrayal, and that kindness, even when exploited by those who would do harm, remains a strength rather than a weakness. Sometimes justice wears no shining armor, arrives on no white horse. Sometimes it comes through fingerprints and databases, through years of patient waiting, through the relentless love of family. Tonight's story leaves us with questions that echo beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines, beyond even the resolution of this single case. What drives someone like Carmen Marie Hunt to target those whose only crime is having an open heart? How many other Ray Neals might be out there, their stories of violence hidden behind death certificates marked natural causes? Could a more thorough initial investigation have spared the Neal family 3 years of uncertainty and pain? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had that gut feeling, like Ashley did, that something wasn't quite right? How far would you go to uncover the truth for someone you love? Share your stories, your insights, your own experiences with justice delayed but not denied. And if you believe in the power of true crime storytelling to bring light to the darkness, to give voice to the voiceless, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Together, we can ensure that stories like Ray Neal's are never forgotten, that justice finds its way, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually rises to the surface. Until next time, remember, sometimes the biggest acts of courage come not from those who wear badges, but from those who refuse to let love die with their loved ones.
Police cordoned off the scenic spot to investigate the woman's death, suspecting she may have been pushed from the top of the cliffs.
You've been living with this secret for the last 12 years.
Point Cartwright Cliffs rise majestically over Queensland's Sunshine Coast. During the day, tourists flock here for breathtaking ocean views. But at night, it transforms into something sinister, dark, desolate, the perfect spot for murder. In July 1997, a young woman's body was discovered at its base. Within hours, police dismissed it as just another suicide. Case closed. But they overlooked something crucial. The killer's own son knew what really happened that night. For 27 years, he carried this devastating secret, watching his father walk free, leaving a trail of endangered women in his wake. Meanwhile, a grieving family fought tirelessly against a system determined to ignore them, convinced their beloved Megan would never take her own life. It would take decades of persistence, a nationwide manhunt, and a $500,000 reward before the truth would finally surface. This is the story of Megan Rose, a compassionate soul whose trust was betrayed in the worst possible way, and how a calculating killer almost got away with the perfect crime.
Because you are responsible for the disappearance of Barry Waters.
I'm not. I say that is not correct. I'm not responsible for the Barry's disappearance.
But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask you a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensure you don't miss out on any new videos. In the small country town of Morwell, Victoria, Megan Louise Rose was known for her giving heart. As a young girl, she spent her weekends delivering Meals on Wheels and volunteering with the Girl Guides. That same compassion would later shape her career choice, working as a carer for people with disabilities.
She was a fun-loving girl. She got her enjoyment and pleasure from family.
I came into the family when Megan was 2-year-old, just only a little tacker.
By age 24, Megan had built an enviable life for herself. She owned her home, had a reliable car, and financial stability. Rare achievements for someone so young, but it was her kindness, ironically, that would lead her into the path of a predator. In 1995, Megan met Keith Lees at her workplace. He was 48, she was 22. The age gap wasn't the only red flag. Lees was twice divorced, bankrupt, and seemed to have a story for everything that had gone wrong in his life. To Megan's family, he was clearly a man with nothing to offer and everything to gain.
Yeah, extremely worried, because I wasn't worried. Really, then we didn't fear for her life, but we knew that he was in her life for his personal gain. And he was 48-year-old and she was 22. Like, crikey, he had 2 failed marriages, bankrupt, and Megan had everything going for him. Like, goodness me, what's going on here?
But to Megan, he was someone who needed help. When Lees poured out tales of his marriage problems, Megan offered him temporary shelter. If you're ever stuck, there's always room at my house, she said. The next morning, Lees arrived with a computer and a chest of drawers. He never left. For Megan, this was her first serious relationship. Despite her family's growing concerns, she remained determined to make it work. Within a year, she made a decision that would seal her fate, agreeing to move to Queensland with Lees and his 10-year-old son, Greg. The relocation marked a dramatic shift in Megan's life. She left behind her support system, her hometown, and the independence she'd worked so hard to achieve. Her family watched helplessly as she uprooted her life for a man who seemed to be expertly manipulating her generosity. They saw what Megan couldn't, that Keith Lees was slowly isolating her, taking control of her resources, and positioning himself to exploit her trust in the worst possible way. No one could have predicted just how tragically right their concerns would prove to be. Within months of the move to Queensland, the relationship began to crumble. Megan started to see glimpses of Lees's true nature. By July 1997, she'd had enough. She called her mother with news that should have marked a new beginning. She was coming home. Instead, it would be their last conversation.
So she was planning to come home. She was getting out of there.
She had rang my mother on the Wednesday night to say that she was coming home. She was moving back home to Morwell.
On the evening of July 17th, 1997, the walls of a Queensland apartment echoed with raised voices. 11-year-old Greg Lees lay in his bed, a familiar knot forming in his stomach as he listened to another argument between his father Keith and Mayan. These fights had become more frequent since their move from Victoria, but tonight felt different. The intensity in their voices, the raw emotion, it wasn't like the usual disagreements. Through the thin walls, Greg heard Megan's final act of defiance, a door slamming with such force that the apartment seemed to shudder, followed by the sound of her car engine roaring to life as she drove away into the night.
All I remember hearing was the argument and then her slamming the door behind her and driving away.
What happened next would haunt Greg for decades, playing over and over in his mind like a horror film he couldn't stop watching. His father, Keith Lees, came to his room to say goodnight, his demeanor oddly calm for someone who just had such a heated argument. But shortly after, Greg heard another door close. Softer this time, more deliberate. Curious and uneasy, he got up to investigate, his bare feet quiet against the carpet. The apartment was empty, filled with an eerie silence that spoke volumes. His father, who would later adamantly claim to police that he'd stayed home all night with his son, was gone. The night stretched on, and somewhere, in those dark hours, a tragedy was unfolding. In the early morning of July 18th, as the first rays of sunrise began to illuminate Point Cartwright Cliffs, a passerby made a grim discovery. At the base of the towering cliffs, Megan's body lay broken on the rocks. The incoming tide lapped at the scene, threatening to wash away any evidence of what had really occurred. By midday, Queensland police had already reached their conclusion. Suicide, they said. Simple as that. No suspicious circumstances, case closed.
This particular case was investigated by the police, and there were no suspicious circumstances at all.
But the scene told a different story, one the police chose to ignore in their rush to judgment. Megan's shoes, later examined by her desperate family, bore scuff marks consistent with being dragged, not walking. The pattern of wear and tear spoke of resistance, of a struggle, not of someone walking voluntarily to their death. Her clothes were torn in ways that suggested a violent confrontation, rips and tears that couldn't be explained by a simple fall.
Oh, the clothes, that's huge. Because of the rips and the scratches on her shoes and the way her pants were, they're all consistent with being dragged.
Most tellingly, her prescription glasses, which she needed for driving and wore religiously, were mysteriously absent from the scene. Adding to the mounting suspicion was Keith Lee's behavior in the aftermath of Megan's death. While most people would be paralyzed by grief after losing a partner, especially under such tragic circumstances, Lee sprung into action with chilling efficiency. Within hours of identifying Megan's body, a task he performed with unsettling composure, he was already making phone calls, not to console family members, not to arrange a funeral, but to claim her life insurance policy and collect her final wages.
Or 12:30 on that day, he rang Tower Life at 1 o'clock and said that he was the beneficiary of this policy and he wanted it paid out. What did he have to do to get it? He also rang her employer and said, Megan jumped off a cliff last night. She's got wages due to her, so I'll give you my bank number and you can put it in there.
The body wasn't even cold, yet Lees was already calculating his financial gain, dividing up her possessions like a vulture circling its prey. It would later emerge that Megan had unwittingly signed a $200,000 life insurance policy, believing it was income protection, another of Lees's carefully orchestrated deceptions.
You had to be insured for 13 months to claim suicide. Megan had been insured for 13 months and 3 days.
A coincidence too convenient to ignore. To her family, who had received a hopeful phone call from Mayan just 2 days earlier about her plans to leave Lees and return home to Victoria, the suicide ruling was beyond absurd. It was an insult to her memory. Her mother, Christine, knew instantly what had really happened.
From the moment that I opened the door to the police and they told me that she was dead, I knew before they'd finished getting it out of their mouth that he'd killed her.
Pretty much all of her dreams had come true. Everything that she'd worked for had come to place. But there was a price on it. There was a price on her head.
The signs of foul play were glaring, but Queensland police seemed determined to look the other way. Each piece of evidence they dismissed painted a clearer picture. Not of suicide, but of a carefully orchestrated murder. The life insurance policy stood out as the most damning red flag. Just over a year before her death, Megan had signed papers she believed were for income protection. Only days before her death did she discover the truth. Keith Lees had manipulated her into signing a $200,000 life insurance policy. The timing was suspicious. Suicide claims were excluded for the first 13 months. Megan died exactly 3 days after this period expired. Lees's actions in the hours following Megan's death were equally incriminating. While most people would be overwhelmed with grief, Lees orchestrated a disturbing parade of financial claims. At 12:30 p.m., he identified her body. By 1 o'clock p.m., he was on the phone with the insurance company, asserting his rights as beneficiary. Within the same hour, he contacted her employer, providing his bank details for her final wages. This wasn't the behavior of a grieving partner, it was the calculated moves of someone who had been waiting for this moment. The physical evidence told its own story. Megan's shoes bore scuff marks inconsistent with someone walking voluntarily to their death. The damage pattern suggested she had been dragged. Her clothing showed similar signs of struggle, with tears and marks that police inexplicably chose to ignore. Then there were her glasses, a detail that would haunt investigators for years. Megan wore prescription glasses, especially while driving. Yet they weren't found at the scene. Months later, Lees mysteriously mailed them to her family. They were covered in sand, raising questions about how they ended up in his possession and what story they might tell. When Megan's family begged police to test the glasses for evidence, they refused.
He told me she killed herself. Get on with it.
Perhaps most suspicious was Megan's car. Found near the cliffs, it appeared to have been meticulously cleaned. Any trace evidence that might have told the story of her final moments had been wiped away. Yet again, police showed no interest in this glaring anomaly. Despite the family's pleas, despite the mounting evidence, despite the obvious financial motive, authorities remained steadfast in their suicide ruling. For Megan's family, this wasn't just incompetence, it was a betrayal of justice. Each ignored piece of evidence, each dismissed concern, each refusal to investigate further allowed a killer to walk free. While they grieved their daughter and sister, Keith Lees was already moving on, ready to find his next victim, which was going to be a woman with a substantial family inheritance. The playbook was familiar. Gain trust, move in, then show his true colors. But this time, when she refused to sign over her inheritance, Lees revealed the darkness that Megan's family had long suspected. His threats became so severe that the woman was forced into hiding, disappearing to protect her life and her assets. Unable to secure his payday, Lees returned to Victoria. There, he set his sights on another vulnerable target, Barry Waters. The parallels to Megan's case were striking. Waters had a $150,000 life insurance policy, with his wife as the sole beneficiary. Lees, ever the opportunist, befriended Waters' wife and soon moved in as a lodger. Shortly after, Barry Waters vanished. Like Megan's death, Waters' disappearance was initially staged to look like suicide, but this time, Victorian police saw through the facade. They gathered evidence, built a case, and finally charged Lees with murder. When confronted about Waters' disappearance, Lees's response was tellingly defensive.
Did you kill Barry Waters?
No, I have not. I have not done anything to... I like Barry. All right? He had a lot of problems, okay? But I have no beef against Barry whatsoever. I have no reason to kill Barry.
The conviction for Waters' murder should have been a wake-up call for Queensland authorities. Here was proof of what Megan's family had been saying all along. Keith Lees was a calculating killer who used financial gain as his motive. Yet even after Lees was sentenced for Waters' murder, Queensland police maintained their stance on Megan's case. There was insufficient evidence, they told her still grieving family, but the Waters case had exposed Lees's methodology. He targeted vulnerable individuals, manipulated his way into their lives, and exploited them for financial gain. When manipulation failed, he resorted to violence. The pattern was clear. Megan hadn't been his first victim, and without intervention, she wouldn't be his last. The similarities between the cases were impossible to ignore. Both victims had substantial insurance policies. Both deaths were staged to look like suicides. Both occurred after Lees had wormed his way into their lives. Yet while Victorian police saw these red flags for what they were, Queensland authorities remained willfully blind to the predator in their midst. But time was running out for Keith Lees. Unknown to him, the walls were beginning to close in. For 12 years, Greg Lees carried a burden no child should bear, the knowledge that his father's alibi was a lie. That fateful night in 1997, when 11-year-old Greg heard his father leave their apartment after Megan, he became an unwitting witness to what would become a decades-long deception. All I remember hearing was the argument and then her slamming the door behind her and driving away, Greg would later reveal. But there was more. After saying goodnight, Keith Lees hadn't stayed home, as he claimed to police. I went out to find out if somebody was coming back in or if somebody had left, Greg recalled, and it was just me in the house. He was definitely gone. The next day, Keith Lees sat in on his son's police interview at Maroochydore Police Station. Before entering, he gave Greg a chilling instruction in the parking lot. Don't say anything that would get either of us into trouble. Under his father's watchful eye, Greg kept quiet about what he'd witnessed. This secret would haunt Greg into adulthood.
He's always been sly. Always. It's just in his character. It's not guile, it's just pure slyness. That's all it is. It's like a fox. Basically said words to the effect of, don't say anything that would get either of us into trouble.
By age 23, the weight of his knowledge had become unbearable. I've been holding on to it since I was 11 years old, he said. That's one hell of a secret. When Greg finally decided to come forward, his motivation wasn't revenge. I'm not out for vengeance, he explained. At the end of the day, he's still my dad. I'd rather see that justice was found. His testimony shattered Keith Lee's carefully constructed alibi and provided the breakthrough Megan's family had been waiting for. Greg's courage in breaking his silence came at a personal cost. His decision to speak the truth divided his family, with some relatives opposing his choice to come forward. But for Greg, the burden of knowing what happened that night had become heavier than the cost of telling the truth. His testimony would prove crucial in finally bringing his father to justice, transforming him from a silent witness to a key player in unraveling a decades-old murder. In June 2023, Queensland Police announced a $500,000 reward for information leading to a conviction in Megan's case. After 26 years of inaction, the tide was finally turning. The police, armed with Greg's testimony and a fresh look at the evidence, approached Keith Lees at his Victoria property for questioning. But Lees, ever the manipulator, had one last card to play. The day after police questioning, his vehicle was found abandoned. The 72-year-old had vanished, triggering a nationwide manhunt that would span 6 months. CCTV footage captured glimpses of his movements in the days following his disappearance, but like a ghost, he managed to stay one step ahead of authorities. The search intensified as public interest in the case grew. Greg made an emotional appeal for his father to surrender, adding another layer of drama to an already compelling manhunt. The man who had evaded justice for nearly 3 decades was now Australia's most wanted fugitive. Lees' time on the run showcased his survival instincts. He changed locations frequently, used false identities, and relied on his years of experience in manipulation to stay hidden. But even the most careful predator eventually makes a mistake.
Help us to bring justice for Megan after all of this time.
In January 2025, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A public tip led investigators to a property in Durrall, New South Wales. After months of careful surveillance, police moved in. The man who had orchestrated Megan's death and spent nearly 3 decades avoiding accountability was finally in custody. The arrest was anticlimactic for such a dramatic case. Lees was taken without incident. But for Megan's family, it was the moment they'd fought 27 years to see. Their relentless pursuit of justice, their refusal to let Megan's story be forgotten, had finally paid off.
As soon as he was arrested for the murder of Barry Waters, we thought, well, there you go. Look at this. There's proof. One of these Queensland police will sit up and take notice now.
Queensland police immediately sought Lees' extradition. The man who had once dismissed their investigation as a suicide would now have to face the evidence that had been ignored for far too long. For Megan's family, this arrest marks the beginning of the end of a 27-year nightmare. But their story serves as a haunting reminder of how easily justice can be delayed when authorities rush to conclusions.
There is a side of relief. It's not nice to have to live in fear for 27 years. Yesterday, that fear left. This should have happened 27 years ago.
What happened on Point Cartwright that July night in 1997? Did Lees act alone, or did someone else know more than they revealed? And how many other victims might there be, still waiting for their stories to be heard? If this case has taught us anything, it's that no secret stays buried forever. Let me know in the comments what you think really happened that night and whether you believe Keith Lees will finally face the justice he's evaded for nearly 3 decades. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories that deserve to be told.
Mr. Smith and his cousin were walking home after a night out when they encountered an unknown male assailant who fatally stabbed Christopher.
A spring night in Ottawa, 1996. The Portage Bridge stretches between two cities, its lights reflecting off the dark waters below. For most, it's just another crossing between Ottawa and Gatineau. But on April 12th, this bridge would become something else, a crime scene where a 22-year-old's life would end in shocking violence, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt two cities for nearly 3 decades. The bridge has always been more than just steel and concrete. It's a connector of lives, of stories, of destinies. On any given night, countless people cross its span, each carrying their own tales. But some nights change everything. Some nights write stories in blood. That April evening seemed ordinary enough. The air was crisp with spring's lingering chill. The kind of night where you pull your jacket closer and quicken your steps toward home. Christopher Smith was doing just that, walking with his cousin after a night out. They were young, carefree, their laughter echoing across the empty bridge. They couldn't have known that someone else was there in the darkness. Someone waiting. Someone who would turn this ordinary bridge into a landmark of tragedy. For 28 years, this case would perplex investigators, torment a family, and remind a community that sometimes the most haunting mysteries happen in the most familiar places. This is the story of a murder that went unsolved for nearly 3 decades. Of a killer who walked free while a family waited for answers. And of the relentless pursuit of justice that would finally bring the truth to light.
This case, of course, goes back to April 12th, 1996.
But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask you a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensure you don't miss out on any new videos. Christopher Smith wasn't just another statistic. At 22, he was a young man brimming with the kind of energy that makes youth so precious. Those who knew him spoke of his kindness, his infectious laugh, the way he could light up a room just by walking into it. He was the kind of person who made friends easily, who carried dreams in his pocket like loose change, always there, always within reach. To his family, he was simply Christopher, a son, a brother, a cousin, who had his whole life stretched out before him like an endless horizon. April 12th, 1996, started as just another Friday. Spring was making its presence felt in Ottawa. That time of year when winter finally loosens its grip and the city begins to shake off its cold weather lethargy. The days were getting longer, and the weekend beckoned with its promise of freedom and fun. For Christopher, it was a chance to spend some time with his cousin, to enjoy a night out in the city they called home. The evening unfolded like countless others before it. The cousins spent their time together, likely sharing jokes, making plans, living in those carefree moments that seem infinite when you're young. As the night drew on, they decided to head home, choosing to walk across the Portage Bridge, a decision that would prove fatal. The Portage Bridge was, and still is, a vital artery connecting Ottawa to Gatineau, spanning the Ottawa River with its impressive structure. During the day, it's busy with commuters, tourists, and locals going about their business. But at night, especially in those early morning hours, it takes on a different character. The steady stream of traffic thins to occasional passing cars, and the pedestrian walkway becomes a lonely stretch of concrete and steel. It was on this walkway, somewhere between Ontario and Quebec, between night and morning, between life and death, that Christopher and his cousin encountered the stranger. What began as an ordinary walk home suddenly erupted into violence. The exact details of what triggered the confrontation remain unclear. Perhaps a random act of aggression, perhaps a robbery gone wrong. What is known is that in those terrifying moments, a knife appeared in the darkness. Christopher's cousin would later describe the horror of those moments, the sudden escalation, the flash of steel, the desperate struggle. In mere seconds, what should have been a simple journey home turned into a nightmare. The attacker struck with deadly precision, plunging the knife into Christopher. As quickly as he had appeared, the killer vanished into the night, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable tragedy. Emergency services were called, their sirens piercing the quiet spring night. But for Christopher, it was already too late. There on the bridge, under the cold glare of streetlights, a young life slipped away. His cousin, who moments before had been sharing in the simple joy of a night out, was now a witness to an unspeakable tragedy. The news spread through Ottawa and Gatineau like a shockwave. In these twin cities where violent crime was relatively rare, the brutal murder of a young man on one of the area's most prominent bridges sent ripples of fear and disbelief through the community. Parents held their children closer. Young people looked over their shoulders more often, and the Portage Bridge, once just a convenient crossing, became a place of shadow and memory. For Christopher's family, that night marked the beginning of a nightmare that would span decades. Their son, their brother, their cousin had left home on a spring evening, full of life and promise, only to become the subject of police reports and newspaper headlines. As they struggled to process their devastating loss, they couldn't have known that their search for answers was just beginning. A search that would stretch across 28 years of questions, hopes, and heartbreak. In the immediate aftermath of Christopher Smith's murder, the Ottawa Police Service launched an intensive investigation. The Portage Bridge became a hub of activity as investigators combed every inch of the crime scene. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, forensics teams worked methodically, collecting what would prove to be crucial evidence, including DNA left behind by the killer. Yellow police tape fluttered in the spring breeze, a stark reminder that this familiar landmark had become something sinister. The initial response was swift and comprehensive. Detectives canvassed the area, going door to door in nearby neighborhoods, their notebooks filling with statements that ultimately led nowhere. They interviewed Christopher's cousin repeatedly, trying to piece together every detail of that fatal encounter. The description they gathered was frustratingly vague. A male assailant appearing suddenly in the darkness, the attack happening so quickly that details became blurred in the chaos and trauma of the moment. Local media covered the case extensively. Christopher's face appeared on television screens and in newspapers across both cities. His family made emotional pleas for information, their grief raw and palpable as they faced the cameras. "Someone knows something," they said, their voices breaking with the weight of loss. "Please come forward." But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the promising leads began to dwindle. The DNA evidence, which would eventually prove crucial in solving the case, presented its own frustrations in 1996. While investigators had this biological signature of the killer, DNA technology was still in its relative infancy. Without a suspect to compare it to or a comprehensive database to search against, even this powerful piece of evidence became just another dead end. It was like having a key, but no lock to fit it into. As the first year passed, the investigation began to lose momentum. The flow of tips slowed to a trickle. The media coverage, once prominent, gradually faded to occasional mentions on anniversaries of the crime. The case files, once at the top of detectives' desks, slowly made their way into filing cabinets, then into storage boxes, joining the ranks of other unsolved murders that haunt police departments across the country. For Christopher's family, this slow descent into a cold case was agonizing. Each passing day without answers felt like a fresh wound. They kept his memory alive through small rituals, celebrating his birthday, marking the anniversaries of his death with renewed calls for information, holding on to his photographs and possessions like anchors to a past that seemed increasingly distant. They watched as other cases were solved, other families found closure, while their own questions remained unanswered. The community, too, felt the weight of this unsolved crime. The Portage Bridge, once just a convenient crossing between cities, had become a reminder of unresolved tragedy. People would walk or drive across it, their eyes drawn to the spot where Christopher's life had ended, wondering if the person responsible might be passing by at that very moment. The case became urban legend, the kind of story parents would tell their children to warn them about being careful at night. As the years began to accumulate, the case of Christopher Smith became more than just an unsolved murder. It became a symbol of justice delayed. Each new detective who reviewed the file found the same frustrating dead ends. The DNA evidence sat in storage, waiting for technology to catch up to its potential. Witnesses' memories grew increasingly unreliable with time. The trail, already cold, seemed to be freezing over completely. Yet, even as the case appeared to stagnate, forces were at work that would eventually break it wide open. Scientific advances were revolutionizing forensic investigation. New techniques were being developed that would eventually turn cold cases hot again. But in those early years, as the 20th century drew to a close and a new millennium began, Christopher's murder remained an open wound in the history of Ottawa, a reminder that sometimes the most haunting mysteries are the ones that happen closest to home. Time has a way of changing everything except the need for answers. As the years rolled by, Ottawa changed. The skyline evolved, governments came and went, and new technologies transformed daily life. But for Christopher Smith's family, time seemed frozen in that April night of 1996. Each passing year brought the same questions, the same pain, and the same hope that somehow, somewhere, the truth would emerge. The calendar pages turned relentlessly. 5 years became 10, then 15, then 20. A new generation grew up crossing the Portage Bridge, many unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded there. Christopher's contemporaries moved forward with their lives, building careers, starting families, growing older. He remained forever 22, his story incomplete, his case file gathering dust in the Ottawa Police Archives. But while the case appeared dormant on the surface, the world of forensic science was undergoing a revolution. The DNA technology that had been in its infancy in 1996 was evolving at a remarkable pace. What had once been cutting edge became routine, and new techniques emerged that could extract information from even the smallest traces of evidence. Each advancement brought with it the possibility that old cases just like Christopher's, might finally yield their secrets. In 2020, nearly a quarter century after the murder, the Ottawa Police Service made a decisive move. The case was officially reopened, not as a mere formality, but with a fresh team of investigators armed with new technologies and perspectives. The original evidence, carefully preserved for all these years, was about to tell a new story. The team's approach was methodical and comprehensive. They didn't just review the old files, they rebuilt the case from the ground up. Every piece of evidence was re-examined with modern techniques. Witness statements were revisited, timelines reconstructed, and the crime scene was analyzed using contemporary forensic methods. But it was the DNA evidence, that small trace of biological material left behind by the killer, that would prove to be the key. The investigation team worked in close collaboration with specialized forensic laboratories, utilizing cutting-edge techniques that would have seemed like science fiction in 1996. The original DNA sample, preserved for decades, was subjected to new forms of analysis that could reveal information about physical characteristics, ancestry, and familial connections. It was painstaking work requiring patience, precision, and persistence. For months, the investigation proceeded quietly, away from public attention. The team knew they were onto something significant, but experience had taught them the importance of discretion. They were building more than just a case. They were constructing a bridge across 28 years of silence, connecting that tragic night in 1996 to the present day. Then, in late 2024, everything changed.
Thanks to advancements in DNA technology, we developed a suspect profile that ultimately led to a breakthrough.
After nearly 3 decades of mystery, a name emerged from the evidence: Lawrence Deal. The suspect was not some drifter or career criminal, but a respected member of society, a former Environment Canada meteorologist and prominent figure in British Columbia's soccer community. The revelation was stunning, but the investigators knew their work was far from over. They needed to build an airtight case to prove beyond doubt that this man, living a seemingly ordinary life on the other side of the country, was the same person who had taken Christopher Smith's life on that bridge so many years ago. They worked meticulously, gathering additional evidence, establishing timelines, and confirming that Deal had indeed been in Ottawa in 1996. As the pieces fell into place, the investigation moved into its final phase. The years of silence were about to end, and a truth hidden for almost 3 decades was about to come to light. For Christopher's family, who had never given up hope, justice was finally within reach. The bridge between past and present, between crime and consequence, was about to be crossed.
I'm just shocked, but it's just something that, what? Like there's no indication that would have been him involved in at all.
December 2024 brought an arrest that would shake 2 cities to their core. Lawrence Deal, 73, lived in a $3.25 million home in an upscale Vancouver neighborhood, a far cry from the Portage Bridge where Christopher Smith's life had ended nearly 3 decades earlier. To his neighbors, Deal was the aloof retiree next door. To the BC soccer community, he was a celebrated figure, a former director, coach, referee, and Hall of Famer. But to Ottawa police, he was something else entirely, the prime suspect in a murder that had haunted their city for 28 years. The arrest operation was executed with surgical precision on December 10th. Vancouver police, working in coordination with Ottawa authorities, approached Deal's home in the early hours. There was no dramatic standoff, no chase through the streets. Instead, a man who had lived decades of freedom after allegedly committing an unthinkable act was taken into custody quietly, almost anticlimactically. The moment handcuffs clicked around his wrists, nearly 3 decades of mystery began to unravel. The news of Deal's arrest sent shockwaves through multiple communities. In Vancouver, those who knew him struggled to reconcile the respected figure they thought they knew with the accusations he now faced. Others painted a different picture, describing him as unfriendly and distant, a man who kept to himself and rarely engaged with those around him.
I wouldn't consider him the most friendly neighbor, to say the least. But I don't know about the deep secrets that he has in his closet.
The contrast between Deal's public persona and his alleged crime was stark. Here was a man who had built a life of apparent respectability, a career meteorologist with Environment Canada, a prominent figure in sports administration, a homeowner in one of Vancouver's most desirable neighborhoods. Yet, investigators had linked him through DNA evidence to a brutal murder committed nearly 30 years earlier. It was a duality that challenged people's assumptions about who could be capable of such violence. As details emerged about Deal's past, investigators revealed a crucial piece of information.
We know Lawrence Deal was in Ottawa in 1996 for work-related reasons, and we're seeking anyone who may have information about his activities or timelines during that period.
This simple fact connected the geographical dots, placing him in the vicinity at the time of Christopher's murder. The revelation raised disturbing questions about how many times he had crossed paths with his alleged victim's family and friends in the years since. How many times he had read about the case in newspapers or seen it on television, all while keeping his alleged secret. The Vancouver soccer community, where Deal had been a fixture for 3 decades, was particularly shaken. His contributions to the sport had earned him accolades and respect. He had shaped young athletes' lives, made decisions that affected thousands of players, and been enshrined in the BC Soccer Hall of Fame. Now, that legacy was forever tarnished, his achievements overshadowed by allegations of a horrific crime. For investigators, Deal's arrest was just the beginning. Questions swirled about whether this was an isolated incident or if there might be other unsolved cases connected to him. The timeline of his life, his movements, his work history, his travels became the subject of intense scrutiny. Detectives began the painstaking process of cross-referencing his DNA with other unsolved cases, searching for any potential links to other crimes. The man who had lived freely for 28 years was flown to Ottawa to face justice. As he was led into the courthouse for his first appearance, the weight of nearly 3 decades of investigation, grief, and unanswered questions seemed to hang in the air. Second-degree murder charges were formally laid, setting in motion a legal process that would attempt to bring closure to one of Ottawa's most enduring mysteries. With Lawrence Deal behind bars awaiting trial, the impact of his arrest continues to ripple through multiple communities. For the Smith family, the arrest brought a complex mixture of emotions, relief intertwined with renewed grief, as memories of Christopher and the night they lost him surfaced again. Nearly 3 decades of waiting had led to this moment, yet the path to full closure still stretches ahead as the legal process unfolds. The case has become more than just the story of a solved murder. It stands as a testament to the evolution of forensic science and the unwavering dedication of investigators who refuse to let cold cases fade into obscurity. The Ottawa Police Service's groundbreaking use of investigative genetic genealogy has opened new possibilities for other unsolved cases, offering hope to countless families still waiting for answers. Christopher Smith's story reminds us that behind every cold case is a human life cut short, a family left in limbo, and a community forever changed. The Portage Bridge still stands connecting Ottawa and Gatineau, but it now carries a different meaning. Not just as a site of tragedy, but as a symbol of justice finally served. As Lawrence Deal faces the charges against him, investigators continue their work, examining cold cases from the regions where he lived and worked, ensuring no stone is left unturned. The question that haunts many minds remains. Could there be other victims whose stories are yet to be told? What would drive a respected professional to allegedly commit such a horrific act? How did he manage to build a life of apparent normalcy while carrying such a dark secret? And perhaps most chillingly, how many other killers walk among us, hiding behind facades of respectability? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this case has taught us anything, it's that justice may be delayed, but with persistence and advancing technology, it's never truly out of reach. Don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories that remind us that every cold case is a human story waiting to be told.